What if Obi-Wan and Yoda train Luke and Leia? Our story begins on Polis Massa, where Bail Organa and possibly the last two surviving Jedi Masters, Obi-Wan and Yoda, are discussing what their next move should be and what is to become of the children. As their conversation continues, Yoda suggests that the two kids should be separated in order to keep them safe and away from the Empire. And after hearing his proposal, Bail was in favor of this. After all, he and his wife have always been talking about adopting a girl. And then Yoda believed that the young Luke would be best to be with his aunt and uncle on Tatooine, due to it being far away from the Empire and he would be with his family. But then this raised a question with Obi-Wan, and he asked what is to become of him and Yoda, where Yoda stated that he would be going into exile and that Obi-Wan would be watching over Luke. Shortly after the conversation ended, Obi-Wan ran up to Yoda in complete disbelief. How could the former Grand Master of the Order just abandon the Jedi and the Republic, who they fought so hard and so long for, just like this? So Obi-Wan would confide in Yoda about everything and give the old master his idea of what they should do, which was to train the twins, seeing as they were the only people in the galaxy that could potentially stop the Empire and destroy the Sith for good. And after hearing Obi-Wan's plan, Yoda was not fully on board. He already failed the galaxy once before when he failed to kill Palpatine, and he did not want to do it again. But Obi-Wan persisted and begged Yoda to not give up and to remember all the Jedi who they needed to do this for. So Yoda would reluctantly agree to help him on his journey. And now all that they needed to do was get Leia back from Bail Organa. Luckily he hadn't left Polis Massa yet, and they were able to catch him before he left. And while Bail was very sad to let Leia go, he would understand that the Jedi needed to train her, and she was possibly the galaxy's last hope. And after that, the Jedi would set to Ossus to begin the children's training. As Palpatine sat in his new Imperial Palace, which was the former Jedi Temple, he bathed in the glory of the destruction of the Jedi Order, as he, a Sith, made it a palace of the dark side in their former home, which for thousands of years stood as a beacon of light and hope. It was a perfect revenge, not only killing all the Jedi, but making their former chosen one do it as well, making him his own servant. But as Palpatine was exploring the deserted temple, he suddenly felt as if the course of the entire galaxy had been changed. But no matter how hard he searched within the Force, he could just not figure out what had caused such a disturbance. Could it have been a change in Vader's heart? Or maybe it was a possible rebellion growing? But none of those were possible, as any rebel threat would have been dealt with in the same way as the Jedi, and Vader had no one left except Palpatine. But until Palpatine could find out what had caused that Force tremor, he just had to wait. Cut back to Obi-Wan and Yoda and the twins on Ossus, they decided that the old Jedi main temple would be their new training grounds. And shortly after arriving on the planet, the Jedi would learn why they were drawn to the planet. They were drawn there because it was a light side Force nexus, and it was so far away from the Empire that it would be near impossible for anyone to discover them. And while Yoda at first thought it was a bad idea to train both the twins, he did eventually warm up to the challenge and begin laying all of his knowledge in front of them. And it was decided shortly after that Yoda would train the children in the aspect of the Force, and Obi-Wan would train them in lightsaber combat. It was a good arrangement. Yoda would train the kids how to understand the Force and the light side, and Obi-Wan would teach them Form 3, 4, and 5. And although he preferred to just teach them Form 3 Sorzu, he did understand that it was important for them to learn different aspects. And it very quickly became apparent that the kids were unnaturally strong with the Force, just like their father. And while Leia seemed to excel within the Force aspects of their training, quickly rising to the same potential as a Jedi Knight after only a couple of years, Luke, on the other hand, preferred lightsaber training. And he very quickly mastered Form 5, just like his father. And after seeing how the twins would train, it stung Obi-Wan, seeing how they were just like his father. And thanks to the temple the Jedi set their base on, the temple provided them with many old Jedi texts and the location of many other forgotten Jedi temples across the galaxy. And seeing how the Empire was hunting down and destroying any remnants of the Jedi, they thought this was too good of an opportunity to pass up. But due to Yoda's increasing old age, he was unable to accompany them on many missions and preferred to stay back. But that was really never a problem, as Obi-Wan and one of the kids would leave while the other would stay with Yoda to train, which at times proved to be a bad idea as the twins helped keep each other in check. And on more than one occasions, Luke would almost fully give in to the dark side of the Force when fighting the Empire, especially when fighting the Inquisitors, who Luke viewed as complete traitors to the Jedi Order and the Republic. And after 13 years of training with the kids, Obi-Wan and Yoda would agree that it was time for the young Jedi to finally make their own lightsabers, instead of just using the ones at the temple, and so the 4 Jedi would set off to Ilum. But as soon as they arrived, they could sense something was wrong and amiss within the Force. Not only was the entire planet under Imperial control, but the planet itself was completely ruined. But they couldn't just turn back now. As they landed on the planet, they could sense a dark presence lurking within the shadows of the caverns. However, the 4 Jedi would continue their descent into the caves, and insist that Luke and Leia must go in by themselves, as it was part of the ritual for them to fully face their fears. And Luke and Leia would reluctantly agree to this and go in. And after multiple hours of waiting, Luke would return with his kyber crystal. And at first he was ecstatic about this, he soon realized that his sister was not not there yet, and was about to descend into the caves again when he was stopped by Yoda, who insisted that there was just something that Leia must do alone. But before he could protest, a couple of dozen stormtroopers flooded the entrance and opened fire on the surprised Jedi, who quickly defended themselves. Back in the cave, Leia was having a hard time finding her kyber crystal when she suddenly heard the ignition of a lightsaber, and when she turned around she saw a red lightsaber and walked out a tall and horrifying machine. As it swung at her, she ran until she hit a dead end, and as she turned around, she could see the beast's mask. But right as she was about to scream for help, she stopped and refused to give in to her fear and trust solely in the Force. And as she calmed down, the Sith began to fade away. And while she at first did not know who or what that was, something about it felt familiar, and a name came to her. Anakin. But before she could think more about it, she felt something in her hand, and when she looked at it, she realized she was holding a kyber crystal. Filled with pride and happiness, Leia ran outside to the entrance of the cave, where she was greeted with the sight of her master and brother fighting off many stormtroopers. Wasting no time, she pulled a spare lightsaber that Obi-Wan had always carried to her hand and helped fight off the troopers, who quickly retreated. But before they could even catch their breath, two Inquisitors would appear, the 7th sister and the 5th brother, and they would jump in and attack them. Luckily, the Jedi have fought them before and already knew their weaknesses. But still, the Inquisitors did put up such a fight that the Jedi for a moment thought they'd have to fall back, until the old Yoda decided he'd finally had enough and force pushed them into a wall, which upon impact collapsed on them both and killed them. Feeling as if they had worn out their welcome, the Jedi would leave the planet right as 3 more Star Destroyers arrived. But that would not be a problem, as they would jump into hyperspace before they could activate their tractor beams. As Luke and Leia sat down and began the construction of their lightsabers, Leia could not focus, and instead her mind went back to the Sith she saw in the cave, and something about it just sent shivers down her spine. So she would tell Obi-Wan about what she encountered in the cave and the name that came to her afterwards. And after hearing her story, Obi-Wan was in complete shock. If what Leia said was true, then Anakin was not only alive, but was now a Sith Lord. But before he walked up to Yoda, Luke would jump up in excitement as he had finished his lightsaber, and the design he made was simple yet elegant, and was somehow similar to Anakin's and Obi-Wan's. And when he turned it on, it revealed an amethyst blade like Mace Windu's, much to the surprise of Yoda. But the celebration was short-lived, as Obi-Wan pulled aside Yoda and told him about his suspicions, to which Yoda would mutter, "Impossible this is," and he would tell Obi-Wan to follow him. But before he left, he would tell Leia to continue building her lightsaber. And as they left, Luke and Leia would look at each other and go back to what they were doing. And after a couple of hours have passed, Obi-Wan and Yoda still hadn't returned, but that was fine because Leia was still constructing her lightsaber. And eventually she would succeed, and her design was more complex than Luke's, but still held similar design to Anakin and the Jedi of old. And when she ignited it, it revealed a green blade. And right as she ignited her lightsaber, Obi-Wan and Yoda would return and was greeted with the sight of 2 new lightsabers, which did bring them immense joy. But when Luke and Leia asked what they were discussing, they would refuse to tell them. Years would pass, and the Jedi would begin to explore many Jedi temples across the galaxy, and while most of them were ransacked by the Empire, who seemed to be wiping out any remnant of the Jedi Order, they would get lucky sometimes and find one that was still hidden and untouched by the Empire. But for most of these missions, Yoda would stay back more and more as he grew older and weaker. And while Obi-Wan was worried about his old friend, he understood that Yoda was well past his prime and was not the same person as he once was. And as their search continued for Jedi artifacts, they would trace one down to the planet of Andon. But as they searched the city, Obi-Wan would begin to sense as if they were being followed by a presence engulfed in the dark side of the Force, and yet felt also very familiar. But before Obi-Wan could finish his thought, he was pushed out of the way by Luke right before a lightsaber barely missed the back of his head. And when Kenobi spun around, he was met with the sight of the very person Leia had described to him, and the very person he thought was dead, the former Jedi turned Sith, Anakin, who wasted no time and charged at them and jabbed at Obi-Wan's chest, but barely missed and rebounded by clashing his blade against Luke, who jumped in to protect his master. As Darth Vader stared into the eyes of Luke, he saw fear and anger in the boy's eyes, and yet they seemed also familiar. That did not matter to Vader as he pushed away Luke's lightsaber and tried to disarm Luke by using the same move he used on Dooku all those years ago. But Luke would sense what Vader was doing and would force sleep out of there, just as Obi-Wan would seize the opportunity to strike at Vader's leg, which would cause Vader to stumble as he tried to regain his balance and re-engage Obi-Wan. As their blades clashed, the 2 former brothers fought with such intensity that the twins had a hard time catching up and seeing who was who. All they managed to see was quick bursts of red and blue as Darth Vader smashed down on Obi-Wan's lightsaber, as he was quickly breaking down Obi-Wan's defense by crashing down his crimson blade with such strength that it reminded Obi-Wan of a Gundark. And Darth Vader could sense that his old master was weakened and repeatedly brought down his lightsaber on Obi-Wan, who barely managed to keep his saber up and away from his face. But that was becoming harder and harder as Vader persisted his attack and was about to finish off his old master when Obi-Wan released a force push on Vader that sent him crashing into a nearby building. And as Luke ran over to the injured Obi-Wan to help them escape, Vader would swing at Obi-Wan's back, but barely would miss it. And not having enough energy to fight back, the twins would engage Darth Vader. And while the twins might have momentarily held their own against Darth Vader, he quickly rebounded and broke down Luke's defense and cut his arm off and force pushed him against the ship, which left Leia all alone fighting the Sith Lord. Seeing how badly her brother was injured, she would use the Force to increase her speed and strength to fight the Sith. And the two would just sing clashes at each other, with both using any opportunity they got to get the advantage. And while Leia was holding her own, she was quickly tiring out and was about to lose when Obi-Wan used their ship's laser cannon and fired at the Dark Lord, which gave Luke and Leia enough time to escape. Wasting no time, they quickly jumped into hyperspace and made their way back to Ossus and dumped Luke into a bacta tank, and Obi-Wan tended to his wounds. But as Obi-Wan and Luke recovered, Leia demanded to know what was going on and who Darth Vader was, in which Obi-Wan, seeing no other option, would tell her and Luke about the truth of her parents, but would leave out some of the details such as Anakin choking Padme and Anakin kind of being the reason the Jedi are dead, as Obi-Wan did not want to burden them with all of this at once. And after hearing all of this, Leia would storm off and Luke would just keep on saying, no, that's impossible. But over time, Luke and Leia would begin to forgive Obi-Wan and Yoda and eventually would understand why they had to keep this from them, and Luke soon grew to accept his new robotic arm and had to relearn how to fight with a lightsaber, but over time he would fully recover. Unfortunately though, Yoda would not, as his sickness got worse and he grew weaker. But before he died, he would put all of his remaining knowledge inside of holocrons for future generations to learn from. And eventually, 20 years after Order 66, the former Grand Master of the Jedi Order would join the Force. Following this, Obi-Wan would believe that Luke and Leia were officially ready to become fully fledged Jedi Knights. And seeing how he was probably the last surviving council member, he would take it upon himself to make Luke and Leia Jedi Knights. And in the following 4 years, Luke and Leia would join the growing rebellion and help them take on the Empire. And eventually, Luke would decide to take on his own Padawan, a human male named Jason Barr. And while Leia did not take on her own Padawan, she did help the rebellion grow in numbers and in strength. And the twins would often help the rebellion destroy many Imperial factories and training facilities, which did help rally people to their cause. And for Luke and Leia, things were coming together, but for Obi-Wan, he could sense that something was wrong, as if an old enemy was laying on Tatooine, waiting for him. So he would discreetly leave for Tatooine. After arriving, he would soon learn of the carnage that awaited for him there, as the farm that once belonged to Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru was burnt to the ground, and their corpses were left there as a message. And Obi-Wan knew there would be only one person who would do this to get to Obi-Wan. And Obi-Wan knew that there was only one person who would do this to get to him. And as he explored more, his suspicions were confirmed as Maul confronted him on the rocky mountains of the desert. Maul, after waiting for decades to finally take his revenge on Obi-Wan, would rush down at Obi-Wan and nearly would take his arm off with one fatal swoop, but Obi-Wan would step aside and trip Maul, who quickly got up and rebounded and attacked Obi-Wan and managed to clip the side of Obi-Wan, whose defense would not break. And losing patience, Maul would rush at Obi-Wan and would try the same attack he used on Qui-Gon Jinn. And Obi-Wan would sense this and play along until the last moment, and right before Maul could stab Obi-Wan, Kenobi would dodge it and cut right through the lightsaber and into his chest, killing Maul. And after burying the body within the mountains, Obi-Wan would return and continue to help the Alliance, but the memory of Maul would linger in his mind permanently as a reminder of the dark side. And eventually, after 24 years of Imperial rule, Luke, Leia, Obi-Wan, and the rebels decided that now was their time to destroy the Empire once and for all, and so they decided to stage the battle over Coruscant. To show that the rebels were a force to be reckoned with, it also just happened to be the location of where the newly revealed Death Star was above. And as well as that, almost all of the high-ranking Imperial officers were on Coruscant at the moment, as well as the Emperor. And seeing as this was the perfect opportunity, they would gather all the rebels and jump into hyperspace. As the Emperor sat in his throne room of his Imperial palace, he suddenly felt a great disturbance in the Force, similar to the ones he felt all those years ago. As he looked to the sky, he suddenly saw thousands of rebel ships land from hyperspace and begin to attack the Imperial fleet. But how was that possible? It was the most heavily armed planet of the entire galaxy. Why would the rebels risk everything to attack it? But it didn't matter, as this would be the downfall of the Rebel Alliance for good, thought Palpatine, and he would send thousands of more troops into the space battle above. But before that could happen, a squadron of X-Wings would blast them out of the sky, making room for dozens of landing shuttles to land in front of the Imperial Palace, and exiting the ship would be hundreds of rebels led by 4 Jedi. How ironic. The place they once held so dear to their hearts would be where the Jedi would finally die for good. And as the rebels stormed the former Jedi Temple, they were soon attacked by stormtroopers, purge troopers, and their leader, Darth Vader. And while the rebels took on the stormtroopers, the Jedi would charge at the purge troopers and Darth Vader. But this time, instead of being overwhelmed by the Jedi, Vader was finding himself falling back. And seeing how he could not take on these Jedi in a 4v1, he would have to have them separated. He would do this by force pushing the boy and his Padawan across the hall and crashing down into the lower levels of the temple. As Luke and Jason, who were separated from everyone else, wandered the halls of the abandoned Jedi Temple, Luke could feel all the pain that has happened there all those years ago. And the Master and Apprentice were soon confronted by 2 Inquisitors and a dozen Purge Troopers. And while this may have been a challenge for the old Luke, the new Luke was far more prepared and powerful, showing the same speed, strength, and determination as the Jedi of old had shown in their height. And so Luke would charge at the Inquisitors with no fear, and Jason would take on the Purge Troopers. In the other side of the temple, Leia and Obi-Wan fought Vader, whose power had dramatically greatly increased since the last encounter they had, as he swung his blade at Obi-Wan, which barely clipped his side, and would bring his saber up and block the attack Leia was preparing. As their sabers locked, Vader looked into the eyes of the young Jedi. She had the same look as the other boy, anger and fear, but she also had the look of determination and peace. And similar to the boy, she also seemed very familiar to Darth Vader, and that's when you realize the striking resemblance to Padme that she had. But how? Vader killed her over 20 years ago. But Vader would have to put that thought to the back of his mind as Obi-Wan recovered and was charging at him once again. As they fought, they would fill the halls with the sound of clashing blades, and the blinding lights of the three warriors illuminated the walls. And as they fought, Vader would utilize the same moves he used to defeat Obi-Wan and Luke on Andon. And for a while that would work, as Obi-Wan would have to fall back. But Darth Vader would be pushed back as the two Jedi quickly rebounded and pushed on. Back in the space battle, the rebels were becoming quickly overwhelmed as the Death Star kept pushing the rebels closer and closer to defeat. But while the Empire may have believed they were closing in on victory, in reality, the rebels were just distracting the majority of the Imperial forces and were just buying time for the rebels to disable the Death Star shields, which was proving to be harder than expected as the ground team was suffering extreme casualties but kept on pushing forward. And the rebels would push on as the shield generators became closer and closer, but before they could reach it, Imperial reinforcements would arrive and push back the rebels. Luckily, right as they were about to retreat, Luke and an injured Jason would re-enter the fight, would help the rebels fend off against the troopers and defeat them all. But right as they were about to disable the shield generators, the person they least expected would walk into the room. And as the Emperor looked around at what had happened, he would shoot a powerful barrage of Force lightning at them all. As the fight between Vader and the Jedi continued, Vader would grow stronger as he fed off of their fear and anger, which allowed him to slice through Obi-Wan's chest and force push Leia across the Great Hall. As Vader slowly walked over to Obi-Wan, he told his master how he's waited for this moment for a long time, and how now was the time for the Jedi to die once and for all. But right before he was about to deliver the killing blow, Leia would yell at Vader, "Don't do it, father." And upon hearing those words, Vader just stood there as he looked back and demanded to know what she meant when she said that. And seeing how she was the only thing keeping Obi-Wan alive at the moment, she would tell Vader the whole truth, which would be met with denial as Darth Vader denied it all and said that he killed Padme and the children, as she would tell him to search his feelings and how he knew it to be true and the Emperor lied to him, which Darth Vader tried to deny, but deep down he knew that what she was saying was the truth and that the Emperor not only took his wife, but everything in his life. And Darth Vader would lower his lightsaber and would walk away from Obi-Wan. And as Vader ran through the halls of the Jedi Temple, he looked across everything and realized all the pain and misery he caused. His head was filled with anger and hatred for Palpatine. It was he who took everything from him and forced him to do his bidding. It was Palpatine who made every waking moment a living hell for Vader. Vader was not free from Palpatine, he was a slave to him, but not anymore. It was time for Vader to finally make a decision of his own choice. And as he arrived at the center of the Jedi Temple where the shield generator stood, were shooting a barrage of Force lightning at the rebels, and his son, if what Leia said was true, was writhing in pain. Wasting no time, Vader would force push Palpatine away and ran towards him with hatred in his eyes and lightsaber ignited. Seeing how his apprentice was no longer loyal to him, Palpatine fought back and shot a Force lightning at Vader, which he quickly deflected and dodged, and continued his pursuit of Palpatine, the man who created all of his suffering. And realizing that his Force lightning would not be enough to stop Vader, Palpatine would take out his lightsabers and engage Vader in one final duel of the fates. Despite being over 120 years old and well past his prime, Palpatine was still one of the greatest lightsaber duelists of all time, and proved that to be true as he matched each and every one of Vader's strikes with resistance and aggression, and he soon began to overpower Vader. But this time, Vader had nothing he feared to lose, and fought with the determination of a true Jedi. All he wanted to do was kill Palpatine and right his wrongs. But that became more and more impossible as Palpatine kept on pushing him back, and would fire a powerful stream of Force lightning at Vader, frying much of his cybernetics. But this time, Vader wasn't alone, as Luke, Leia, Obi-Wan, and Jason joined the fight against the ancient Sith Lord. And to Palpatine, this was a surprise he did not foresee, but that didn't matter. Palpatine would not back down, and he would kill all of them. And he proved this as much when he quickly killed Jason by force pulling him into his crimson red blade and decapitating him. And almost as quickly nearly cut Obi-Wan in half. And after watching the lifeless body of his Padawan fall to the ground, Luke, fueled by rage, would lunge at Palpatine and would prove that he was the master of Form 5 like his father. But that would prove to be futile, as Palpatine just shot Force lightning at him and would cut off his last remaining organic arm, leaving Luke with only his robotic arm, which was already damaged from the lightning. But despite this, Palpatine was finding himself becoming quickly overwhelmed and was losing ground, and in response to this would unleash the most powerful Force scream he had ever done, followed by a barrage of Force lightning, and those two combined would prove to be detrimental to the Jedi, as they lost their concentration, and Palpatine would seize the opportunity, as he would slide under Obi-Wan Kenobi and dodge his swing and stab him through the heart, killing the man who caused so many of his problems. And Luke, unable unable to believe what he had just seen, filled with rage, would run at Palpatine one more time with his one good hand and would fight him again, and for a brief period would push Palpatine back with his rage, but like the time before, was pushed back and was nearly burnt alive by his Force lightning. Having enough of this, Leia and Vader would charge at Palpatine, and as Palpatine swung for Leia, Vader would jab at Palpatine's chest, would barely miss it as Palpatine dodged it and countered it with his own fury of attacks, which cut deep into Vader's breathing mechanisms as well into his chest, leaving him gasping for air. But seeing how Palpatine was focused on Vader, Leia would use this chance to slice Palpatine across the back, and Vader would deliver the final blow by stabbing Palpatine through the neck. Following that, any surviving rebels that didn't die from Palpatine's Force lightning would disable the Death Star shield generator, which would allow Hera Syndulla to fire the killing blow and to destroy the Death Star. Immediately after this, the remaining rebel fleet, filled with a renewed determination, would destroy much of the Imperial fleet and would drive them off-world. Back on Coruscant, while the citizens celebrated the Empire's defeat, Luke and Leia would mourn the death of Obi-Wan and Jason, but would soon realize that Darth Vader, or Anakin, was trying to reach to them. As they got by his side, he would apologize for everything and would mourn for the death of everyone he caused. But his children would comfort him and tell him that they forgive him. And upon hearing those words, Anakin would finally find peace and would join Obi-Wan in the Force. After the Battle of Coruscant, the rebels would begin their fight across the rest of the galaxy, which was much easier to do with the Emperor dead and their superweapon destroyed, alongside many Star Destroyers and many high-ranking Imperial officers such as Thrawn and Tarkin. And within 2 years, the rest of the galaxy would be liberated from the Empire. And following the Battle of Jakku, which was the Empire's final stand, and the destruction of Exegol, the rebels formed a new republic, and the Jedi Order would once again become the peacekeepers of the galaxy under the leadership of Grand Master Luke and Leia, but this time would not just serve the Republic, but would serve everyone. And they would set up their temple on Tython and revert back to the older ways of the Jedi, and the galaxy would enter an age of peace and prosperity. And that is what if Obi-Wan and Yoda trained Luke and Leia from birth. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I really feel like this was one of the more likely scenarios. I had a great time writing this video. If you did like this video, please make sure to like and subscribe. It would mean a lot to me. And now to answer some of the questions about the decisions I made. The reason I chose Ostis was because I really believe that is such an interesting planet and has a lot of potential in Star Wars What If, even if it is not really a major player in it. And who is Jason Barg? In short, he's really just a Jedi I made up because I thought it'd be cool if Luke had a Padawan, and he's not really a survivor of Order 66, he was really just a kid living on the streets. And for the lightsaber colors I gave Luke and Leia, I really feel like Luke would have had a purple lightsaber because he does seem more emotional than other Jedi, and he would use the dark side. And like we saw in the movies, he would give into his anger occasionally, but he ultimately would stay in the light. And for Leia, she would have green because she always just seemed to be more calm-minded and attuned to the Force. I really hope that answers some of your questions, and with that, my fellow Star Wars nerds, may the Force be with you.